your taxes, mind your business, and keep Will Smith's wife's name out.
The room went insane. But that joke, that was the clean version.
I was sickened by the standing ovation. I felt like Hollywood is just spineless, en masse.
One slap, one standing ovation, an entire industry exposed. But here's the thing nobody kept talking about after the dust settled. The comedians didn't just go after Will Smith.
They're both they do weird things in their house, and young men have left their house screaming to get away from them in their mentorship.
They went after his family, and one name in particular kept coming up. But here's what nobody is connecting. Will Smith's son was already living in the crosshairs long before his father ever walked onto that Oscar stage. And once the slap cracked the armor on the Smith family image, Eddie Murphy, Dave Chappelle, and the entire comedy world took aim at everything standing behind it, including Jaden. This is the story they haven't fully told yet. For 3 decades, Will Smith didn't just sell movie tickets. He sold a vision of the perfect Black American family. Successful, stylish, spiritually grounded, emotionally open. The Fresh Prince became the patriarch. Jada became the strong, evolved partner. And their children, Jaden and Willow, became the living proof that it all worked. That you could have the fame, the money, the love, and the well-adjusted kids. Hollywood bought it. The media sold it. And for a long time, the public believed it. But here's what was always sitting just underneath the surface. The Smith family brand wasn't just a byproduct of their success. It was managed, carefully, professionally, relentlessly managed. Every public appearance, every Red Table Talk confession, every social media post, these weren't just moments of authentic sharing. They were content. They were brand strategy. They were the product. Jim Carrey wasn't just talking about Will Smith, the man, when he said that. He was talking about Will Smith, the institution, the machine, the family brand that had been constructed so carefully over so many years that the people inside it had started to disappear behind it. And that included Jaden. From the moment Jaden Smith appeared in The Pursuit of Happiness as a child, he was already a character in his father's story. He wasn't just a kid, he was proof of concept. Proof that Will Smith's values worked. Proof that raising a child in the spotlight with the right philosophy and the right parents produced something extraordinary. But Jaden had his own ideas about who he was. And as he grew up, those ideas got louder. The fashion choices that defied gender norms, the philosophical tweets that the internet half admired and half mocked, the music career that was genuinely ambitious, but also easy to caricature, the public statements about identity that were ahead of their time in some rooms and deeply uncomfortable in others. Jaden Smith, in other words, gave comedians material long before the slap, long before any of this. And comedians remembered when Dave Chappelle took the stage in Liverpool in September 2022, 5 months after the slap. The headline story was his analysis of Will Smith, and that analysis was sharp, genuinely sharp. Nobody who heard it walked away unimpressed. Dave's central argument was something close to a verdict, that Will Smith had spent 3 decades performing a version of himself that wasn't real, that the slap wasn't an aberration, it was the truth finally breaking through, the mask cracking, the real man showing up in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. He said Will had done the impression of a perfect person for 30 years, and then ripped his own mask off and showed the world he was as human, as flawed, as ugly as the rest of us. That landed hard. But here's what people underplayed in the coverage. Dave didn't stop at Will. Because the thing about Dave Chappelle is that he thinks in systems. He doesn't just roast individuals, he identifies patterns. And when he looked at Will Smith's unmasking, he didn't just see a man who lost his composure. He saw a family that had been selling an image, and he understood that when one member of a family cracks, the whole architecture becomes visible. Dave has been outspoken for years about identity performance, about the distance between who people present themselves as and who they actually are. He's built entire specials around the discomfort of watching people perform versions of themselves that the culture demands rather than versions that are true. Jaden Smith openly gender nonconforming, philosophically provocative, unapologetically strange, in the best and most genuine sense, had become, over the years, a symbol of exactly that kind of performance debate. Was Jaden's public identity authentic self-expression, or is it another layer of the Smith family brand, carefully differentiated from Will's to expand the audience while still serving the same machine? Dave never answered that question directly from the stage, but he asked it in the way comedians ask questions sideways, through implication, through the kind of observation that lands as a laugh, but stays in the room as a thought. And once the slap happened, once the armor was off, those observations started hitting differently. The most revealing moment in Dave's entire response to the slap situation wasn't the joke. It was when he said he saw himself in both men. Not just Chris Rock, not just Will Smith, both. That admission carries more weight than most people gave it credit for. Because what Dave was really saying is that he understood the pressure to perform, the pressure to protect, the pressure to maintain an image while something real and complicated is happening underneath it. He'd lived that. And he was watching a man he'd known for decades implode under the weight of the same pressures. Except Will had waited 30 years for the explosion, and the explosion happened on the most watched night in Hollywood. After his own attack on stage, which happened just 5 weeks after the Oscars, when a man tackled him at the Hollywood Bowl, Dave had even more standing to speak on this. He knew what it felt like. And in his 2023 Netflix special, The Dreamer, he came back to the whole conversation with something that had clearly been sitting with him. He talked about calling Chris Rock after the slap, about Chris picking up the phone when virtually the entire industry was trying to reach him, about Chris being the one who absorbed the hit, stayed standing, finished the job, and then turned the wound into material. That, Dave said, was the comedy answer to violence. You don't fight back with your hands, you fight back with the work. But underneath all of that, underneath the respect for Chris, the analysis of Will, the personal experience of his own attack there was something else Dave was watching. He was watching the Smith family narrative unravel in real time, and Jaden was right there in the middle of it. The night of the slap, while the world was still processing what it had just seen, Jaden Smith posted online. The message was brief, it was direct, it was unmistakably in support of his father. And it opened a door that, once opened, was very hard to close. Here's the thing about posting in defense of your parent the night they commit assault on live television. It invites scrutiny, not because of who you are, because of what you just attached yourself to. Jaden wasn't just expressing love for his father. He was wading into a public controversy that had already split the world and asking the world to look at him. And the world did. Comedians, specifically, took note because the comedy community had just watched one of their own get hit on the biggest stage in the world. And here was the son of the man who did it, a young man who had spent years making himself deliberately controversial and culturally visible, jumping into the conversation. The jokes came. They were not gentle. Now, this is where we have to be precise. The same way the best commentators in this space have always been precise, what was being mocked wasn't simply Jaden's identity. Jaden has been open for years about his relationship with gender norms, about his fashion choices, about the way he moves through the world in a way that doesn't conform to traditional expectations of masculinity. That's not new. That's been Jaden's story for a long time. He's spoken about it, he's owned it, he hasn't hidden from it. But here's where the comedy world found its angle. Will Smith, the man who slapped Chris Rock, had built his entire brand on a very specific version of Black American masculinity. Protective, strong, righteous, the provider, the defender, the man. It was the core of everything, from Fresh Prince to Ali to King Richard. Will Smith was, for 30 years, Hollywood's most bankable embodiment of a very particular kind of masculine identity. And his son had spent years publicly, deliberately, and visibly rejecting almost every element of that identity. That contrast and the fact that Will had just committed an act of hypermasculine performance on live television, apparently in defense of that very image, was, to comedians, irresistible. Dave Chappelle, who has never shied away from examining the contradictions of masculinity, performance, and identity in the Black community, had been watching this dynamic for years. Dave's comedy has always been willing to go into territory that makes people uncomfortable, not because he enjoys cruelty, but because he believes the uncomfortable truth is more useful than the comfortable lie. The question of how Will Smith's very public masculine identity coexists with Jaden's very public rejection of that same identity, that's a question that Dave, in his way, had been circling for a while.
They're both bisexual. They do weird things in their house, and young men have left their house screaming to get away from them in their mentorship.
Now, here is where we have to be absolutely clear about the difference between what is documented, what is verified, and what is allegation. Jaguar Wright, the same artist who was publicly raising concerns about Diddy years before that, story broke wide open, made public statements about the Smith household that were, to put it plainly, explosive. She alleged that young men who came to Will and Jada's home for mentorship left in distress. She made these allegations publicly and repeatedly. These are unverified claims. They have not been proven. Will Smith has not directly addressed them. We present them as allegations, only the same standard to any responsible commentator should apply. But here's why those allegations matter to this story. Not because they are proven, because of who made them and when. Jaguar Wright had a documented track record of raising concerns about powerful industry figures before those concerns entered mainstream conversation. When she started speaking about the Smith household, the comedy world, which had already been sensitized by The Slap, by Jim Carrey's brutal assessment of Hollywood's complicity, by Eddie Murphy's precision-targeted joke, was paying attention in a way it might not have been previously.
Sickened. I was sickened by the standing ovation. I felt like Hollywood is just spineless, en masse.
Jim Carrey's point about Hollywood being spineless en masse wasn't just about the standing ovation. It was about a broader pattern, an industry that protects its most profitable assets from scrutiny regardless of what that scrutiny might reveal. An industry that labeled Janet Hubert as difficult and buried her career while protecting Will Smith's. An industry that watched the entanglement story surface on Red Table Talk and turned it into a meme instead of a conversation. That's the context in which Jaden Smith's identity, Will's hyper-masculine performance at the Oscars, and the unverified allegations about the Smith household all started getting discussed together, not as separate stories, as parts of a single pattern. Let's go back to the Golden Globes. January 10th, 2023. Eddie Murphy on stage accepting the Cecil B. DeMille Lifetime Achievement Award. The joke everyone remembers is the 3 rules. Pay your taxes. Mind your business. Keep Will Smith's wife's name out of your mouth. But go back and listen to everything around that joke. Because Eddie Murphy is not a man who wastes words. He never has been. Every syllable Eddie puts on a stage is calculated. He's doing this for over 4 decades. He knows exactly what he's doing and exactly what he's saying.
Your taxes. Mind your business. And keep Will Smith's wife's name. Mouth!
The setup wasn't just comedic framing. Eddie told that room full of the same Hollywood machinery that had protected Will Smith for 30 years that he had a blueprint, a definitive blueprint for success, prosperity, longevity, and peace of mind. And then the punchline wasn't just a reference to The Slap. It was a lesson addressed to the next generation, the up-and-comers, the ones just starting out. Think about who was in that room. Think about who was watching at home. And then think about who in the Smith family had been very publicly positioning himself as the next generation of the Smith brand. Jaden Smith had been making music, making films, building his platform, inserting himself into cultural conversations about identity and authenticity and what it means to be real in an industry that rewards performance above all else. Eddie Murphy, who built his entire career on being brutally, specifically, unapologetically real about the gap between image and truth, pointed directly at the consequence of choosing image over reality. And he delivered that point in the room where it would hurt most. After the ceremony, when pressed backstage, Eddie Murphy made something clear. He said it wasn't just a joke. It was a point about toxic masculinity, about the way Will Smith had positioned himself, about what he had done on that stage. There are allegations public, widely circulated, and unverified about Will Smith's private life, and specifically about dynamics within the Smith household. We have referenced some of them earlier in this script. We reference them again now, not to present them as truth, but because the question of why these allegations have gained the traction they have is itself a story. The allegations made by individuals, including Jaguar Wright and others, which touch on questions about Will Smith's private identity, about dynamics in the Smith home, and about the experiences of young men who entered that circle, have been in circulation for years. They are not new. They predate The Slap. What changed after The Slap is that the armor came off. The machine that had been protecting Will Smith's image, the same machine Jim Carrey described as spineless en masse, suddenly had less incentive to keep suppressing these stories, because protecting Will Smith had stopped being good business. And when the machine stops protecting you, the stories it was suppressing start moving faster. Here is what we know for certain. Janet Hubert, the original Aunt Viv on Fresh Prince, had her career destroyed by a narrative that labeled her difficult and unprofessional.
You know, words can go. I lost everything. Reputation, everything. And I understand you were able to move forward, but you know those words, calling a Black woman difficult in Hollywood is the kiss of death. It's a kiss of death, and it's hard enough being a dark-skinned Black woman.
She sat beside Will Smith at a reunion and described what it had cost her her reputation, her livelihood, everything. She said that calling a black woman difficult in Hollywood is the kiss of death. And someone or something had made sure that label followed her. If Dave Chappelle was the analyst and Eddie Murphy was the executioner, Chris Rock was the one who had actually been hit. And when he finally spoke, not 3 nights after, not in an interview, but a full year later in a live Netflix special that the entire world was watching, he said things that made everything else sound like warm-up material. But the line that landed differently from all the others, the line that wasn't a joke, that was a verdict, was this one. His wife was hurting him way more than I ever could. Jaden Smith grew up in that house. He grew up watching that performance. He grew up inside the machine that Chris Rock, Eddie Murphy, Dave Chappelle, and Jim Carrey all, in their different ways, identified as the source of the explosion that happened on March 27th, 2022. Chris Rock's final answer to the question everyone had been asking for a year, why didn't he fight back, was simple, specific, and quietly profound. Because his parents raised him. Because they taught him dignity and restraint, and what it means to hold yourself together when someone tries to humiliate you in public. The implication, unspoken but present, was this. Some people were raised to absorb the hit and keep moving. And some people, regardless of how carefully their public image was constructed, were raised differently. There is a layer of this story that gets less attention than it deserves. The 3 hosts of the 2022 Oscars, Regina Hall, Amy Schumer, and Wanda Sykes had spent enormous effort making that ceremony work. Wanda was backstage in a costume change when the slap happened. When someone showed her the video, her reaction wasn't diplomatic. It wasn't measured. She said she felt physically ill. She said she was still traumatized by it, and her anger wasn't directed at the slap itself. It was directed at what the Academy did after. They let Will Smith stay. They let him collect his Oscar. They gave him a standing ovation. Her response was guarded, measured. It was the response of someone who had grown up, understanding that every word she said would be analyzed. Jaden's response was different, louder, more exposed, and it opened him up in ways he may not have fully anticipated. The comedy world noticed, because Jaden had spent years positioning himself as someone who existed outside the machinery of the Smith brand, the non-conforming fashion, the philosophical independence, the public identity that seemed to deliberately refuse the legacy his father had built. When Eddie Murphy stood in that Golden Globes room and delivered his 3 rules to the next generation, he wasn't just roasting Will Smith. Pay your obligations, stay in your lane, and do not position yourself as something you are not, because the moment you do, the moment you slap a comedian on live television to protect a marriage that by your own wife's account had already been over for years, the whole structure comes down. When Dave Chappelle looked out from a Liverpool stage and said he saw himself in both men and the one who got hit, and the one who did the hitting, he was saying something that goes beyond Will Smith and Chris Rock. And when it breaks, it doesn't just take you down. It takes everyone in the frame with you, on the machine that builds these images, protects them at any cost, and then leaves the people inside them, the Jadens, the Willows, the Janet Huberts, to deal with the consequences when the machine decides it's done with you.
Sickened. I was sickened by the standing ovation. I felt like Hollywood is just spineless, en masse.
Jim Carrey said it most clearly. Hollywood is spineless en masse. Not evil spineless. The distinction matters. Evil has conviction. Spineless just follows the money. And when the money shifts, the protection shifts with it. Will Smith spent 30 years being protected. And then one slap moved the money. And everything that had been protected along with him, the image, the family brand, the carefully curated story of who these people were became fair game. Jaden Smith, who spent years trying to step outside the story, found himself pulled back into it the moment it fell apart. That's the thing about the machine. The mask is off. And what's underneath it is, as Dave Chappelle said, as ugly as the rest of us. Whether that's a tragedy or the beginning of something more honest depends entirely on what the Smiths decide to do next. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Jaden has always been the realest one in that family? And do you think the comedy world went too far or not far enough? Like this video if you stayed until the end. Subscribe if you want to attend us. Next, we'll see you there.